Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 5 of the Grindset stream, episode 5 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. So I don't know where Logos is now. Hopefully he'll come in a bit later, but we can keep going regardless. And the announcement, just made 3,000 subscribers on YouTube. So in about 2 months of doing all this regular content, I've more or less doubled my channel. So that's pretty cool. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Locals. All right. The Democrats' Party of Lies, Mencius Moldbug, May 29th, 2007. UR is not a political blog, and I have no intention of making it one. Not that I have anything against political bloggers. I read them all the time. Many of the blogs on the sidebar are primarily political. It's just that everyone I've ever met who had any serious interest in or engagement with politics has turned out to be some kind of major emotional disturbance or other. I'm sure no one would consider ascribing any such description to me. I'd hate to think I was involved in exacerbating it in my readers, 2 or 3 of whom still returned, like crazed swallows each week to the soiled and desecrated nest. However, I read this statement by one Matthew Iglesias. Apparently, this is some guy who likes to review essays without having read them. Perhaps he has a background in the Academy of Journalism, and it peed me off. Mass market comedy, as seen in Hollywood films, strikes me as a pretty good partner for post-Goldwater conservatism. Comedy, to be funny, usually requires the skewering of the powerful in some sense. But the mass culture marketing demands that your product not actually do much to challenge the prevailing ideas in the world. It's a bit of a paradoxical situation, but it nicely mirrors the efforts of political ideology designed to further entrench their privileges of the country's wealthy elite and its white Christian majority, and somehow do so in the name of anti-elitism. The legend that Iglesias repeats here might be called the central fiction of the Democrats. It is their Dolktos, their donation of Constantine, their succession of Edward the Confessor. It bears no resemblance whatsoever to reality. However, once you believe it, you really need to slurp down more juicy lies by the hundreds. At this point, I will say I agree with Moldbug 100%. The idea that even as of 2007, these people were some sort of like an underdog is laughable. I mean, the quote unquote what white Christian majority? The WASPs weren't in power in 2007, and even 2007 on the Supreme Court, there weren't any WASPs on the Supreme Court then as now. So, I mean, it's. Again, I 100% agree with Moldbug on this. Actually, the CFD should probably be called CFPD because there's no Democratic Party in the United States, and there hasn't been one for at least 75 years. In my opinion, history will probably refer to our present governing party as pseudo-democrats. The last actual Democrat in the presidential office in the United States was probably Grover Cleveland, although a minority of historians may prefer to designate James Buchanan or Monroe. It's also worth noting that some Democratic tendencies were demonstrated by the Republicans of the return to normalcy period, namely Harding and Coolidge. I refer to the Democrats as our governing party because of the simple fact that most people who work in government are Democrats. This is especially true when you consider all the unofficial arms of the government, that is the extended civil service. All those who consider themselves to occupy a position of social or otherwise political public responsibility, the most prestigious tentacles of the extended civil service are the press and educational system, and it's arguable that at least strictly in terms of internet security, these are the most powerful organs of the Polygon. So the other thing to point out here is his account of U.S. political history is actually on point. The Democrats of, say, Jefferson and Jackson, with men like Cleveland, were replaced by the Progressive Democrats, with Woodrow Wilson winning the election in, was it 1912? So you can then, get those in. So he's right that the Democrats shifted a lot in the late 19th, early 20th century with regards to their view of the state, right? The state is now this, thing that they're going to control and then use it for activism to, shape the world in their image. This is, okay, let's see, did that. It is a commonly held misconception that elected politicians hold any significant power in the current Western system of government. At best, they represent figureheads around which power coalesces, and you can follow the power by following the name, as if it were a small and dusty bobber attached to a large and energetic fish. I think it's pretty clear that in most, if not all, actually all cases, there is an actual person who corresponds to the name, and this person is an actual brain and an actual personality and is not infected or otherwise controlled by any kind of evil alien parasite life form. From which I can gather, elected politicians are mostly very nice and thoughtful people, much more pleasant than most of us believe. Let's see. It is a mistake to believe, however, that any of them has any particular power. They are mostly intellectual captives of their various handlers who are smarter than them and who specialize, like computer programmers, in making themselves permanently indispensable to their employers. Any statesman in the 19th century would have sneered at these pathetic puppets and their coutures of blow-dried, backbiting, half-educated clowns. However, there are about as many Republican politicians as Democratic ones. And at least the Republicans are actually Republicans, that is, Puritan fanatics attracted by the gigantic barbecue of Henry Clay's American system and its latest heir, the New Deal. They are just not quite as bad as the Democrats, except for on a few issues where they make up for it by being much worse. This is how the Polygon does its thing. It is a balance of an evil genius sort of way. No one could possibly have invented such a heinous conspiracy. It's just what happened. It's an adaptive system, an evolutionary triumph of deception. Think of it as a little slug thing in your ear like Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and remember that you attempted to extract it, the slug will emit an extremely loud screaming noise. There is no way to avoid this. Now, what's interesting here is Moldbug is actually saying something that I've been saying lately, the idea that because the system is so complex with all these different layers of complexity and so many moving parts, that nobody's really in control. And, he even said that the politicians are at the control of other people. He mentioned computer programmers. Exactly. So this is actually not too bad of an article. I think a lot of what Moldbug's saying here is sensible. In any case, back to Iglesias, who was presumably thinking there is some kind of enlightened, independent, and moderate thinker surveying the pinnacle of history from a comfortable hammock, which appears for some reason to be positioned on its top. In fact, he is a tool of the security force, and so is anyone employed as a public intellectual. Note that I am not an opponent of the security forces. In fact, as a quick look at my archive will demonstrate, gentlemen, I am among the most pro-security writers around, well past Tory and flirting boldly with the possibility of declaring myself a cavalier. However, the color of UR is and will always be orange, the one revolution which was ever glorious. Any connection to a blogger's default template is purely coincidental. In the 21st century, any writer whose work appears anywhere but his own blog is a shill, or at least he should be assumed to be compromised unless proven otherwise. That's true, too. Nothing to say other than that I agree with him there. The internet has all the tools you need to write and be read without being beholden to anyone. If anyone rejects this independence, you have to wonder why. In the kingdom of the slug, people do not go around telling each other that they have or may have a slug in their heads. Therefore, if writers have the option of complete freedom, they have no option but to accept it. The assumption must be that every intellectual institution which exists under the Polygon, which is legitimate in its eyes, is part of it. For example, it makes about as much sense to get your climatology from Exxon as to get your political science from the state. In fact, probably more, because Exxon can probably find a way to make money going either way, whereas the state always wants you to cherish it more. Of course, there is no actual slug in anyone's head, but there are varieties of ways the Polygon manages public opinion in order to achieve the same general result. Most of these techniques were described eloquently by Walter Lippmann in 1992. And I have no reason to bore you with the repetition. Certainly, if you have the universities, the schools, and the press, you can pull off just about anything. In any case, back to the pseudo-democrats and their shrieking monkey lizard Iglesias. The Democrats turned into the pseudo-democrats when they took over by the fanatical Republicans in a series of assaults by manic bird-brain religious politicians who realized that if they shifted their allegiance to this moribund party of a failed detached military force, they could take it over and create a new party even more zealous than the aging melon Republicans whose corrupt and bloody-handed rule, legitimized by terrorist mullahs like Henry Beecher, John Brown, and Julia Ward Howe, had made such a sick mockery of the genteel constitution the Federalist grandfathers designed. A series of international party coups were led by William James Bryan, Woodrow Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt. Bryan's captured the party, but not Washington. Wilson's captured Washington, but was eventually forced into a partial retreat. FDR's captured the U.S. government, thanks largely to deceptive presidential campaign in which he ran as an actual Democrat, has never given it up and never intends to give it up. Historians have christened this fanatical coup with a pleasant name. They call it the Progressive Movement. This may be a good indication of how much you can trust 20th century historians who have tended to be rather unsurprisingly progressives. So the interesting thing here is, so he seems to then say that the more progressive activist Democrats that took over with Bryan and Wilson and FDR are sort of out of the line of the abolitionists, because he mentioned Stowe, Brown, and Howe, and the transcendentalists. And really, this is something that Moldbug and a lot of people on the DR do, and it's frustrating because a lot of these New England thinkers that come up with all these progressive ideas that the DR hates, they're not actually Puritans, they're transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau, and they have a lot more in common with Eastern mysticism. For example, Emerson tried to bring Hinduism into the public consciousness of the United States than anything like, the Puritan fathers of the 17th century. It just doesn't make any sense at all. It's just nonsense. I mean, it's basically just transcendentalists and abolitionists who, they had Puritan forefathers, but that would make about as much sense as saying that, well, Lenin was in Russia, so that the Orthodox Church, because he grew up in that context, gave us communism. That doesn't make any sense at all. Why would you say that? In much the same way, it's a reaction against what they were being brought up with. Richard Gamble's recent book, The War for Righteousness, Progressive Christianity, the Great War, and the Rise of the Messianic Nation, is an excellent guide to the sincere and good-hearted architects of evil who helped the U.S. federal government into its present habit of letting good motivations in the form of increasingly ambitious and unrealistic attempts to erect political institutions based on unscalable and intrinsically unstable blueprints drag it into murderous and counterproductive wars. Rothbard's essay, Power and Intellectuals, World War I is Fulfillment, is a shorter treatment of pretty much the same material. The general MO of the progressive movement in attaining power was to cause problems, then appoint themselves to fix them. There is no better example than the Great Depression, which a few economists are starting to admit was the result of the bubble created by progressive cheap money policies under the early Federal Reserve. Logos, you're here.
I am. How's it going?
Good. So, is there anything you want to say where we're at now?
The general MO of the progressive movement in attaining power was to cause problems and appoint themselves to fix them. I think that's a pretty big claim.
Well, it is a pretty big claim, and the thing that I'd say is the sort of managed democracy of Lippmann that I've been mentioning in almost all of these streams. Once you have these corporate structures that developed as the United States industrialized after the Civil War, you basically have to have some body that can account for them and then bring them to heel, because with the corporate person fiction, these entities are essentially immortal persons that have legal standing, and they're supremely powerful compared to any individual. And so that alone needed a large government bureaucracy to manage. And as society becomes increasingly complex, you just have to have a much larger bureaucracy to do it. I mean, that alone would explain this.
Yeah, I agree. I also think this whole cheap money story is just too easy. The story is way more complicated than just the money supply.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, Moldbug here is a libertarian, so he's probably gonna, they're gonna talk about the Fed and how that then led to the Great Depression, and ultimately, when you have these kinds of issues, it's so complicated because, again, it's back to my point. Nobody's in charge because it's too complicated, and something as complicated as the U.S. economy in 1929 is extremely complicated. And so you might think you're doing something, in the financial system, expecting a certain result, but then you get something completely unexpected.
Right.
All right. Let's see. Where were we here? Right, okay. The only reason we don't think of progressives' descendants, the pseudo-democrats, as a Christian party is that the pseudo-democrats don't want us to. In fact, the theocratic ideology, progressive idealism, is the leading modern descendant of the most powerful American Christian tradition. The mainline Protestants who infested New England in the early 1600s and for some reason have never left. These bastards of the Roundheads and Puritans, whichever you want to call them, and after their defeat of the last Cavaliers, to be clear, the slave power was no picnic either. They have reigned unchallenged in North America and no less outside it. Indeed, more. The beliefs held at Harvard, not those at West Point, and certainly not VMI, are the complicated belches of today's global transnational corporation class, governing class. This is just a special kind of brain damage. Like, I don't understand. New England is New Ireland, okay? So today we don't have WASPs in New England running things. We have the Irish and the Italians. The Supreme Court has no WASPs on it. So I don't know who are these people? Where are they, Logos? Where are they in America running things?
Well, nowhere. Small businesses. Like WASPs are usually like small business owners. Maybe they own some medium-sized corporations. But once you get to the really big corporations, you end up getting like really, really old European money involved. Like, you know, shoot, their names escape me right now. Rothschilds and people like them. The Dutch people that I hear Anderson Cooper's related to or something. You get really old European money involved. Or if you get on the courts, you get like Catholics. Most of the Supreme Court people are like Catholics, not Protestants. I don't know. Justice Scalia Protestant? I mean,
No, I think he's a Catholic too, or was.
well, there you go. Like I figure he's like a Texan guy. Maybe he's a Protestant. If he's not Protestant, I can't think of any Supreme Court justices that are like hardcore Protestant types. I don't know. The whole thing doesn't make any sense. And even according to this guy's own caste system, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because if you look at like who runs things, you look at the intelligentsia, the Supreme Court justices, all those people. He has the WASP people as a different caste than the intelligentsia that are kind of running things at the moment, right? By his own admission, the castes are different, and he's mixing them when it's convenient for him.
Yeah, he mixes it when it's convenient because the cast that he had for the sort of the what you might want to call like the Rockefeller Republicans or the older, Republican Party machine apparatus, the Optimates, they literally are the Puritans. They are the WASPs. Like so on the one hand, the bad guys are the Brahmins, and it's all screwed up, and it doesn't make sense at all. And then furthermore, these ideas were transcendentalism, which is, in fact, it has nothing to do with Christianity at all. I mean, transcendentalism is basically, Eastern mysticism. And he mentioned, Beecher and Stowe. I'm like, yeah, those are transcendentalists. Those aren't Christians, in any sort of orthodox sense. So like the terms here, again, Princess Bride, you keep using that word, but I don't think it means what you think it means. All right. Yep. Let's see here. If they feel some occasional biblical pang, they sometimes call themselves Unitarians, but they have long since discarded the encumbrance of the supernatural, and these days their opinions are simply the truth, science, or reason usually. I'm partially fond of the phrase reality-based community, which is so stupid it's almost ironic. How repugnant can such smugness get? This is our ruling class. This is our governing party. These are the beliefs of celebrities, kings, professors, novelists, poets, painters, and musicians. All the best people look the Democrats' prodigious and lordly asses, bowing and scraping to the ridiculous banalities, whether the planet-wide spoil system they call environmentalism or the combination of saccharine pity with rule by corrupt thug. This is post-colonialism. I'm sorry, but I'm simply refuse to believe that this is in any way difficult for anyone with a brain to tell which beliefs are, in the world of 2007, at least in our cozy nest of real states status and real power, fashionable and which aren't. The central fiction of the Democrats is that none of this is true. Actually, we are living in the British Empire under the rule of Queen Empress Victoria, but of course, 100 years later, prancing lords and dandies, cardinals, and catamites sneer at us as they slide past in their Porsches, crushing the poor under their great alloy wheels. In some obscure way, the British ruling class has managed to merge with the NS, perhaps through one of the Mitford girls, and they have been joined by the Jews who have actually become NS themselves and are also engaging in usual criminal behavior of running global financial corporations and making terrible terrible films that appeal to the lower classes and so on and so forth. This is really weird here too, right? Because now he's like got everybody all jumbled up and confused. I mean, if you're gonna have like the Brahmins, the Jews, and NS all in the same, like what do these words mean at this point?
Well, they don't mean anything. I mean, he's just throwing stuff at the wall to see if anything sticks.
Yeah, exactly. One can become infinitely lost in the infinitely weird details of this bizarre mirage, which is embraced deeply and lovingly with an absolute uncritical credulity by basically the same people who believe in the prohibition 100 years ago, or transubstantiation 5, or was that consubstantiation? Maybe it was consubstantiation. So what Iglesias is trying to tell us in his little snarky micro thought is that he speaks for the resistance, specifically for the BDH faction, and a plucky bunch of underdogs who struggle to defend their last few planets against overwhelming star destroyers of the OV Empire. This is, as I have said, a single gigantic lie. In fact, Iglesias makes a hissing noise when he breathes. He finds your lack of faith disturbing, and he gets angry. Let a lightning bolt shoot out of his hands, and his clone armies are hatching as we speak. Of course, I could be an evil plotter as well. Perhaps I, too, have my clone armies. So why not take a while to make up your mind? Don't stop reading Iglesias, but read UR too. Soon I will send out orange scarves to wear when we make revolution. I think the first half of this article, Moldbug was making a lot of interesting points. The second half of the article, Moldbug just turns, into a blender and then blends everything together into this mush of nothing. I think what we see in the second half, this seems to be resentment. He's like, why aren't I Iglesias? Why don't people pay me like they pay Matthew?
Yeah, and it seems like he's just trying to make up a story. And the more he tries to make up a story instead of doing like a really clear analysis, is you start blending things together because you need them to transition. You have to tell a story about how the progressives become the Democrats, why these different factions align with the Democrats, and so on and so forth. And well, eventually, the easiest thing to say is, oh, they're all just the same faction all along, as you just pointed out, which just doesn't make any sense. Like, he has this whole analysis of caste that he's been leaning on up till now, basically, and now he's just kind of thrown it out because he needs to get rid of it to tell a convenient story.
Yeah. The other thing too is his sprinkling of pop culture references gets really tedious. Like the Star Trek, Star Wars. It's like, okay, we've had this discussion in private with about a lot of people on the DR, like on social media. On the one hand, on Twitter, they'll want you to take them seriously about their political or religious or historical beliefs, but then they'll post all sorts of goofy anime stuff, and it's like, well, what is this, right? Have two separate accounts then, one where you're serious and one where you're goofy, because I can't take you seriously when you do that. And this is the equivalent here on the blog with Moldbug. What do you think?
I don't think it bothers me quite as much as it does you, but I understand why it bothers you.
Yeah. All right. The Reconciliation of Government with Liberty, May 31st, 2007. UR is neither a political blog or a link blog. Frankly, citing others' work detracts from the atmosphere of maniacal solipsism I'm trying to nurture, and it offends my vanity to suggest that anyone may have said anything before me or said it better or worse or both. However, Conrad Roth's History of Western Art. Oh, is this one of these art ones? I don't know if you want to go through all that. Let's see. No, I think this is still political. So, okay. For any readers, where was it? Oh yeah. However, Conrad Roth's History of Western Art from the perspective of podiatric mycosis is simply too audacious to go unnoticed. So is Michael Rozev's Tale of a Murky Intrigue in the Secret World of Gay 90s Geology. And for any readers who found my vicious execration of the 20th century American politics a little immoderate, I have just the book for you, The Reconciliation of Government with Liberty by John Burgess, 1915. I may be unqualified, in fact I am, but some find it easier to accept the same statements from John Burgess's J.D., Ph.D., founder and dean of Columbia's Faculty of Political Science, widely regarded as one of the founders of the modern political science. Of the progressive movement in the concluding chapter of a 394-page book, publishing 3 years after his retirement, which sketches the story of all efforts to secure liberty and government on every continent, and for all human history of burgess rights, down to the year 1898, we had all this limited government in a fair degree, in a fuller measure than any other state in the world. It needed some readjustments, but no radical or revolutionary changes. It did not lend itself to an imperial policy abroad, nor to paternal program at home. A school of sociologists and political economists arose who, impatient of the voluntary methods of religion, charity, philanthropy, have sought to accomplish what they call social justice, the social uplift by government force. There is no question that they have exercised a strong influence in directing the thought of the present, and they have taught the politicians that there is no vote catcher in a system of universal suffrage, comparable to the promise of forcing those who have to divide with those who have not or have less. The Jingo and the social reformer have gotten together and have formed a political party which threatened to capture the government and uses it for the realization of their program of Caesaristic paternalism, a danger which appears now to have been averted only by the other parties having themselves adopted this program in a somewhat milder degree and form. All parties are now declaring themselves to be progressives, and all mean in substance the same thing by this claim: the increase of government power on the constitutional immunities of the individual, the solution by force of the problems of social relations heretofore regulated by influence, by religious conscience, charity, and human feeling, the substitution of the club for the policeman, for the crozier of the priest, the suppression of education, morals, and philanthropy by administrative ordinance. One of the things that is always gets brought up, and this I think is interesting here, right? The immunities of the individual. Yes, but what individual are we talking about? What individual did this government grow to contain? It's the corporate person, right? The reason why, in the 19th century, the United States had such a small government, in part, was choice, yes. But we didn't have these large, private, immortal persons running around, mucking everything up. And, now that they start taking over after 1865, they have all the rights of an individual. So the sort of creep that undoes the rights of the individual, where the government says, well, now we need to, circumvent your rights and overturn your rights, is because those rights were given to corporations, and the corporations, crap the bed, and the government was moving in to regulate it. And so ultimately, as with a lot of these things, Moldbug and the libertarians put the cart before the horse. It's the government is growing in response to these large corporate entities.
The thing I find interesting about this is he says in 1898, we got this small government thing down. I don't know about you, Todd. I'm remembering something that happened in 1865, which is the exact opposite of small government.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know, right? There's that. Well, I mean, that's the watershed moment. So,
I mean, it's like the biggest government can get. I mean, the one safety hatch, like you want to talk about why the government restrains the individuals and violates the Constitution. The one safety hatch that states had, if that thing started happening, was the ability to secede and say, listen, you're getting too radical for me. I can't seem to reform you, so I'm just going to leave you. Well, the second that safety hatch is gone, smaller states and entities lose the power to reform, and they lose the power to leave themselves. And so there's no inertial pressure keeping the government from doing anything but what it's going to do.
yeah.
And so they blame like little things that come after, like progressivism or Democrats or neocons or whatever you want to say. But the fact of the matter is, if there is no escape hatch for unhappy parties that are kind of caught in this cultural zeitgeist, this milieu of, bigger, more complex machine-like structures, well, then there's only one way for it to go. There's no counterbalancing measures. There's no resistance anymore. There's no anything. It's just a long trend toward that as soon as that happens. So I think they're putting the cart before the horse too, not necessarily from the perspective of corporations. I don't disagree, but I'm looking at it from the other perspective.
No, that's a very good point. The idea that the states, that mechanism, the Civil War effectively ended. And of course, then there was no brakes on the growth of government as well. So, and here is his prediction for the result. Remember, this dude is writing in 1915. Next to the bombastic monstrosity of today's Polygon, the regime of Woodrow Wilson was unimaginably small, simple, and humble. It was a libertarian beyond the wildest fantasies of the Cato Institute. But Burgess saw it differently. And let us also profoundly reflect what may be the effect of a vast advantage in government power and activity. In his criticism of Hosbach's recent most valuable work upon modern democracy, Professor Schmoller relates that when in the year 1890 the question of social reform was being considered by the Prussian Council of State, the emperor uttered these profound and for so young a man remarkable words. He said, Das mag Antreilicher, socialer Reform ist Bedingung durch dies. Yeah, I'm not going to do the German. That is the permanent, stable, powerful government, a government standing over all classes in society and independent of them all, might be trusted to say how far force can be safely employed in requiring sacrifices from one class to another. But a changing, shifting government, a government representing either the property class or the property-less class, especially a government representing the property-less or small property class, a government representing the modern democracy under universal suffrage, a government representing the class to be benefited by the confiscation and redistribution of the wealth through government force, cannot be safely trusted with any such power. It would become a temporary despotism which would destroy property, use up accumulated wealth, make enterprise impossible, discourage intelligence and thrift, encourage idleness and sloth, and pauperize and barbarize the whole people. This is no idle prophecy. The whole history of the world's political development sustains it. The history of that development shows beyond any question or cavil that a republic with unlimited government cannot stand, that a republic which makes its government the arbiter of business is of all forms of state the most universally corrupt, and that a republic which undertakes to do its cultural work through the government forces of all forms of state the most demoralizing. If a state will have government undertake these tasks which naturally belong or have come through historical development to belong within the sphere of individual liberty, then it must have a government lifted so far above all classes and party interests that it cannot be controlled or even influenced by any of them. But this authority reaching from above downward and not from below upward, this is monarchy in the original sense of jure divino sovereignty. This is the reason for and the advantage of its existence. But for us, this is not progress. It is for us a regression of the most positive kind known to political history. In the face of this consideration, it is high time for us to call a halt in our present course of increasing the sphere of government and decreasing that of liberty, and inquire carefully whether what is happening is not the passing of the republic, the passing of the Christian religion, and the return to Caesarism, the rule of one by popular acclaim, the apotheosis of government, and the universal decline of the conscience of and desire of true liberty. The world has made this circuit smaller several times before. Are we making it again, or is it only a step backward in order to get a further foothold for another advance in the true direction? Let us hope it is the latter and make it so by keeping always consciously before us as the goal of political civilization the reconciliation of government with liberty, so that however the latter shall be seen to be, the more ultimate shall be seen to be both, ends and means, while the form is only means. This is fundamental in the profoundest sense, and there can be no sound progress in political civilization without it. And with these words, he ends the book. So, I mean, on the one hand, I do agree with Burgess's broad concern for an executive government, a kind of Caesarism. But you see, this is what's interesting, right? Isn't that what Moldbug wants? Doesn't he want a Caesar running everything, a new monarchy? So it's kind of weird. Like, he's got these two narratives in his head that contradict. So the progressives are bad because they are activists and they have replaced the old Democratic Party of Jefferson Jackson with the power of the total state. But also he wants formalism, where you have, an autocrat running the total state. Which is it?
Yeah, there's two types of Caesarism he's talking about. One is kind of like an authoritarian dictatorship, but he's talking about a slightly different kind of Caesarism, which is a dictatorship that keeps power by giving people bread and circus, basically. But that still owes to your point, because if you think about the articles we looked at last weekend, he has this entire model where power is justified by a CEO state via customer satisfaction. What is Caesarism if not using bread and circus to maximize short-term customer satisfaction? So it's not exactly clear, like you said, what the problem is with Caesarism. You know who's in charge, and it's via customer satisfaction model. People aren't happy, give them short-term little doodads until they are happy, and they'll be off your back. So again, this actually goes back to that democracy thing we talked about last time, where he's talking about like peak Finargle and how he'd use the media to control everything and control the media and all this other stuff. And it was unclear through that article if he was like um, gainsaying the system or supporting it because he seemed to not like it because it was quote democratic, but he would support it because you go down the list. It's like it's a checklist of everything a formalist system would want. Um, and so this is just kind of an echo of that because he's not clear and he's messy in what he wants. You can never tell if he should support or oppose whatever system he's critiquing.
Well, exactly. Exactly. It's just, yeah. Attack of the Jazz. Oh, wait, is this short? Okay. Attack of the Jazz Racists, June 1st, 2007. There's a great old Leonard Cohen song, I believe. It's on his crazy Phil Spector album called Jazz Police. Wild as any freedom-loving racist, I applaud the actions of the chief. Tell me now, oh beautiful and spacious, am I in trouble with the jazz police? As so often in San Francisco, life does not just imitate art, it intimidates it. And so in today's Chronicle, as the lead story, no less, we learn that racists have infiltrated the Bay Area jazz community, or as the Sharon puts it, jazz fans decry exclusion. I mean, talk about underground, talk about sleeper cells. We thought we whipped him in Selma. We thought we had Old Bull Connor beat, but suddenly he reappears and he's calling himself Susanna Muscarella and booking the Berkeley Downtown Jazz Festival. Folks, we clearly need to keep more of an eye on these dangerous characters. So, I mean, basically, the takeaway from this is the left just can't ever admit that it's won, right? There always has to be, because it's just following up, him talking about Iglesias. They're always going to have to be this, plucky underdog, even when they're running everything, even when they are the police. Okay, next one. Hillary fires back, June 1st, 2007. Since Dr. Burgess has had his say, it's only fair to showcase Hillary Clinton's perspective of the progressive era. Now we've done this before. We did the same thing back at the turn of the 20th century. Back then, the American economy was dominated by large corporate monopolies. Corruption was far too common and good government far too rare. Women couldn't vote and the minimum wage, well, that wasn't heard of, and workers' rights were completely unimagined. Back then, America was a country filled with haves and have-nots and not enough people in between. In response to these excesses, the progressive movement was born. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, the progressives busted trusts, fought for safe working conditions and fair wages. They created the national park system and replaced a government rife with cronyism with a merit-based civil service. They understood, as the great progressive President Teddy Roosevelt once said, that the welfare of each of us is dependent fundamentally upon the welfare of all of us. Well, actually, what have I been saying? The corporate monopolies. So here I do agree with Hillary Clinton on this point, that it was these corporations that were driving the need for the government to do this. I'm especially into the Roosevelt quote, which I feel may indicate that Mrs. Clinton shares an interest in a paleological grammar. Unfortunately, the pleasures and pains of campaign trail must have delayed her, for I snagged the 10 paleologus myself. In any case, there's no question but that Mrs. Clinton approved these words, whoever wrote them, and I think they're a good way for me to explain why I don't trust history. Every high school student in the United States has a textbook which gives them Mrs. Clinton's interpretation of the progressive era. I would be surprised if a single one gets Dr. Burgess's, perhaps in some obscure Pawling Appalachian backwater, but probably not. In fact, I find myself obviously have some sympathy with Dr. Burgess and his cause, but how did I hear of him? Where did I find his work? I found a gilt and leather 1990s reprint at a used bookstore the day before yesterday. I have never seen Dr. Burgess, as founder of American political science. Two of his students, for example, were Nicholas Murray Butler and Theodore Roosevelt, mentioned by any political essayist, historian, or blogger. I'm sure if I was actually a qualified specialist, this would be different. It is not quite as though Dr. Burgess was airbrushed out of the Kremlin parade. He has a Wikipedia page after all, but it's not a long one. I think this tends to confirm my general perspective, which is that history is not trustworthy in a democracy. In a democracy, power depends on public opinion, and public opinion depends on history. Since history, by definition, is written by historians, democracy vests vast power in its tiny, self-selecting, and utterly opaque elite. Well, see, this is interesting, right? So he's saying that you can't trust the history. Now, obviously, any state that's going to tell a history of itself is going to be self-congratulatory. I mean, that's what you would expect. And he says, well, certain books, I wasn't exposed to. Yes, but you could find them, right? He tells us he found a copy of Dr. Burgess. Now, in China, try to do that. Well, that's going to be a lot easier said than done. Let's say you want to find something written by, Chiang Kai-shek. Not going to happen. That's going to be really hard to do. And so he's sort of making a mountain out of a molehill here, in the sense that for all it's so easy to find this material. I mean, and because in the early aughts, or this is the late aughts, I guess, people were online pushing these materials out so that we could see them. And I think that's really the important part here. Not that the U.S. government has a certain narrative that it tells about itself. All governments do, whether it's a democracy or not. But what is different about the United States is, because we have freedom of the press, we can get these books. And a lot of those formalist totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe in the 30s and 40s, you couldn't do that. Like us.
Well, what I find interesting is that he supposes the two histories are distinct, right? Like there's one that's supplanting the other. There's one taught above the other one. But I mean, after reading the quote from that guy and Hillary Clinton's quote, as our commentary suggests, it seems like they're both talking about the same history from slightly different perspectives. Because you could read the quote that he gave from the PhD guy and just use a principle of sufficient reason and ask why, right? So it's like that old joke we say today. One day for no reason at all, Mustache Man suddenly came to power, right? Okay, well, take the same funny logic and apply it to his quote. One day, for no reason at all, the government just randomly decides to start curtailing civil liberties and just start ramping up regulations and doing some economic redistribution. It just happened, guys, just for no reason, just out of the blue. It just happened, right? No, I mean,
Yeah.
this guy's history says it happened and gives kind of a good guideline about, where in the slippery slope we are, so to speak. But Hillary Clinton's quote kind of gives the why that it happened. Now, maybe, you know, Moldbug disagrees about the why, but he should go into that a little deeper than just saying, "Oh, this is just the implanted history from the victors," or some nonsense. It's like, I think Hillary Clinton's explanation is pretty good. I mean, if you look back at the pre-progressive era, we've talked about this on streams and privately. You had some really grotesque things happening. You had corporations slaughtering their own workers who tried to unionize or whatever. You had this thing called the death special, which was, what was that? It was like a machine gun mounted like car that
Yeah,
would
it
drive
was a
around
car.
and mow down workers in a way so grotesque you'd think it's like Eastern European World War II nonsense going on. That was right here in America. Okay, um, you don't go through stuff like that because corporations have so much power and not have a pendulum swing backlash. To think you're gonna to think that like one would not cause the other or vice versa. It's just it's a bizarre reading of history to call it the least. Now, I mean, you could take issue with like the women voting thing and whatever else, but like I think the grand narrative should be um, corporate power and how crazy it was getting. Um, because look at countries where we didn't. Here's another thing that Moldbug leaves out of his analysis. We always talk about, right? Look at countries that don't reform due to large sectors of private power causing lots of instability for the lower classes. Think about France. Yeah, nobility as a central institution might have been oppressive, but think about people's local Catholic churches. Were they the most helpful at the time? Maybe, maybe not. And the more people felt they couldn't turn to their local private institutions to help them. Well, I mean, the Catholic Church is like a centralized one, but each parish seems to be run kind of privately. You have like bishops that kind of manage things. Um, they don't directly report, except in like meetings. Um, if people feel hard done by even by that's supposed to be the check against like nobility and the people that are persecuting them, they have nowhere to turn and they just riot and burn down everything. Look at the 1917 Soviet Revolution. Because how interesting is it that we're talking about the progressive era stepping into 1915 when in 1917 you had the Soviet uprising, right? Why did that happen? Well, it's complicated history as always, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that you have the monarchy taking too much, economic conditions not being very well for the little people, and so revolutionaries come on and say, "Well, little people, system sucks for you. We'll make you a better one." And they say, "Okay, anything's better than this. Let's go." So if you're looking at that around the 1915 era, things going on in the world, how revolutions happen, so on and so forth, especially the middle class being the driver of a lot of revolutions, right? It's the middle class going, we're afraid of losing all this stuff we've worked hard to get. They'll join revolutionaries to make sure they still have a seat at the table if that's what it takes. Um, you see that, you're the government, you go, man, I think we should make a stable society. How do we stop revolutions? Well, unfortunately for Curtis Yarvin or Moldbug or whatever, government ain't Finargle, right? So it's like he's comparing what the government's facing in the early 1900s with large social mobility problems and so forth with the Finargle government he imagines the government can be. I'm sorry, but Officer Peaceful rather, can't deal with like tens of thousands of angry, middle class people that think they're about to lose everything. They'll get trampled. And so what's the government have to do? The government now has to call a seat at the table with the middle class people that are de facto Officer Peaceful, if there's enough of them, and renegotiate how power is distributed to make sure everything's solvent. And that's the part of the analysis that's always left out.
Yeah, you see, what's interesting too, right? So the sort of overarching theme here is Moldbug is complaining that narratives are, getting buried. But the way he's handling all of this proves that, on his side, the right, the libertarians, the conservatives that he's speaking for, do the same thing. Like growing up, I didn't learn anything about these bloody labor disputes throughout the history of the United States and these corporations. It was only really the last 6 years that I learned about them, and I had no idea. I mean, you had barbed wire, you had watchtowers, you had machine guns. I mean, at one point in West Virginia, they even called in the National Guard and 2 airplanes from the Air Force. I mean, it was just brutal. And why is that covered up, Moldbug? Why do you guys always hide that? For someone who's getting butthurt, about Hillary Clinton's narrative, I think you do protest too much.
Yep.
Okay. So let's see. I think this tends to. I read that. Okay. Of course, the facts of the progressive era are not in dispute. It is a fact that Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, but if facts were all we wanted from history, we need databases, not historians. And of course, both Dr. Burgess and Mrs. Clinton are entirely sincere, or at least the former. And whatever goes on inside Mrs. Clinton's head, I would not dare to speculate. Her views are not her own. They come from her staffers who got them from their professors, whom I'm sure were historians no less capable or sincere than Dr. Burgess. This does not answer the question of why these views replaced Dr. Burgess's, not just in the textbook. At least they didn't, right? I mean, the whole American right is just, papering over these corporate malfeasance and take this sort of Burgess's perspective. I mean, they're not the people who were running the government, but in the sort of like economics sector, that's par for the course. And then also the sort of like informal voluntary associations. As you already mentioned, Logos, a lot of these WASP people are the sort of in the middling position, small business owners, maybe they're a part of like clubs or something. They covered all this up. It's like, now granted, he's in the tech company, so of course he's going to be surrounded by very progressive. And now we would use the term now woke people as well, but it's like he's kind of embodying this the insincerity that he's criticizing these people for, in the sense that he's just papering over a lot of actual facts like massacres and bloody repression of the workers.
Yep. Agree with all that.
Perhaps, for example, the progressive historians were this does not answer the question of why their views replaced Dr. Burgess's, not just in the textbooks, not just under Mrs. Clinton's polymerized coif, but even at Columbia University, where I'm sure President Wilson is now seldom compared to Julius Caesar. Perhaps, for example, the progressive historians were simply right, and Dr. Burgess, who obviously has had a bad attitude, was simply wrong. Perhaps God, the Lord of hosts, was looking on and put a subtle finger on the scale when the tenure decisions were going down. Can we disprove this? We cannot. Another possibility that we're looking at here is no more than intellectual fashion. Why are skirts long one year and short the next? Because in Wintour says so, or is it the stock market? Whatever the answer, I don't know it, and I don't think my girlfriend does either. The word random is much misused, but it represents a negative result in the analysis of cause and effect, and it will always be on the table. Well, At this point, though, it's not random, right? If you want to know about this, you can read American Prosperity by Paul Mazur, where he talks about how, in order to deal with the problem of overproduction, these corporate entities had to create fashion, fads, so that you could constantly sell people stuff that they don't need continually, right? Because you have a totally fine, pair of clothes, but you need to get new ones because they're trendy. And so it's not random. It's see what's interesting is the way Moldbug like puts like the magnifying glass with like laser precision. At least he thinks he's doing it on like the progressives. But then when he wants to like shield the fact that these bad corporate actors are doing all sorts of stuff, he uses very vague, nebulous terms to sort of like smokescreen and shield them. So he's sort of doing for the corporations what he's mad say that Hillary Clinton is doing for the state.
Right. I mean, the difference is, one could argue that Hillary Clinton's analysis was just adding more to what Burgess said. Whereas if you look at what Moldbug is doing, he's very plainly trying to hide something, right? Everything Burgess said is consistent with Hillary Clinton said. She didn't contradict him. He complained about the government getting too big. She's like, yeah, here's the government getting big. He complained the government was getting too redistributive, looking at the lower classes and some sort of Caesarism. She's like, yeah, government totally did that. Here's why it did it. Nothing she did hid any of what he said. What might have changed is the narrative about why it happened, but he didn't really give a narrative. And all we know about that is power abhors a vacuum. People aren't going to believe that just randomly for no reason at all, the government just usurped all this power. Um, but what Moldbug is doing here is actually papering over and trying to actively hide stuff done by the corporations. So to your point, I think that makes it like 10 times worse.
Well, it does, and when you really think about who you're doing this for, right? I mean, obviously, somebody who's a strong partisan for a political party or a politician, is open to criticism, and rightly so. They become clownish and cartoonish. He's doing it for corporations. I mean, this is just the peak absurdity. I mean, whereas at least with the government, there's at least coming at this from an Aristotelian perspective, there's at least some plausible organicness to the thing. There's some plausible organicness of the government. The corporation is totally synthetic, and it makes stuff that we don't need, causing us to get stuck in the rat race to keep on buying more stuff that we don't need. And then how do they maintain their power? Ruthless murder. I mean, that's how it was in the from 1865 until FDR's the Wagner Act when he got rid of private security forces. 1930 is 1935, I think. So yeah.
Agree with all that.
However, there is an even simpler and more disturbing explanation. I think we have to consider the possibility that the extinction of Dr. Burgess's views and the adoption of Mrs. Clinton is an adaptive phenomenon. That is, it is easiest to explain by postulating some effect at some point between 1915 and 2007, in which historians holding Dr. Burgess's perspective were less likely to prosper and spread their ideas, and historians holding Mrs. Clinton's perspective were relatively more successful. Okay, now at this point, I will give this to Moldbug, because when this is exactly what happened to me when I went to college. These sort of the acceptable historical views. You were not allowed to deviate from those. They actively censored and eliminated people that didn't, like yours truly, who didn't go along with that. So I will give Moldbug this on this point, is that that's absolutely true. There is this rigging of the system so that different beliefs can't make it. But again, Burgess's ideas are not suppressed. This is like normative for the entire political right in the United States. So again, whatever.
Yeah, and more to the point, I think this is where it gets really confusing and where I think a really good analysis would win out, right? Because there's a reason why certain historical views adapt and spread and others don't. For some reasons, sometimes it's a good reason, sometimes it's a bad reason. Hillary Clinton's views, a good reason. We're trying to avoid the corporate takeover of the country that could lead to something like a French or 1917 Soviet Revolution. And so historians, kind of being some kind of a immuno response to that sort of thing, might prefer ideas that highlight the relationship between government and corporate power so that people don't get this idea that government power just sprouts out of nowhere, out of a vacuum, and corporations didn't do nothing. Um, Now, in your case, there probably was an adaptive behavior as well that kind of suppressed some of the historical ideas you were trying to spread. You got into your teachers and all that stuff all the time. What we still need to, by the PSR, figure out the reason why your stuff was being suppressed, because it could be a good reason, it could be a bad reason. Likely, it's probably a bad reason, given where we're headed and given the warnings we've been trying to give to people. Um, it's going to be a bad reason, but we should point it out nonetheless, because pointing it out can kind of help us figure out the meta narrative that we're trying to fight and do something about. And I think B and you have already kind of pinpointed that in our talks today. But it would have been interesting if Moldbug had had the clarity to do that analysis in 2007. It might have given people 10 years heads up.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, for Moldbug, for all the world, gives us the impression that what he's really mad at is that he's not Matthew Iglesias. He's not the one in charge, because he would be just as, say, ruthless as the progressives in eliminating opposition if he were the one that had power. And it's really disingenuous to criticize, say, the progressives and the Puritans and Clinton for, being, activist government, when he would do exactly the same thing if he was in charge.
It's another good point. He's always making allusion to the magic ring that you could use to snap your fingers and just kill your opposition. And he thinks that would be one of the perfect platonic forms. I'm sorry. He's not an idealist. That's wrong. I don't know what it is, because he's not he can't be an idealist. Okay, that's like a good thought experiment heuristic of what it would be to be a formalist government, is to have something like that sort of power, so you know who's in charge, you're secure, you can't be supplanted. Okay, well, I mean, if Moldbug was in charge, then he'd have something like the ring, as close to the ring as he could get. So I think that goes to your point perfectly well.
Yeah. All right. Of course, one cause of this would be our first hypothesis, that Dr. Burgess is wrong and Mrs. Clinton is right, given that they are both expressing value judgments. But we're not allowed to do that, Logos. Remember, this is all an engineering problem with no morality at all. What are we talking about? Value judgments here, bro.
Yeah, what's this talk of value judgments? We're supposed to be amoral. I mean, it's impossible because nobody can truly be nihilist, but we're not supposed to be ethical. Come on.
Oh, I know. It's amazing. I mean, this is just amazing. However, it is hard to justify this. And certainly if you read Progressive Equivalence from the Period, The Promise of American Life by Herbert Crowley is a good example. Let's just say I think it would be quite difficult to claim that events since have discredited Dr. Burgess and vindicated Mr. Crowley. A simpler explanation, I think, is just to postulate a feedback loop between progressive victories in Washington, D.C. and in the Columbia Faculty Lounge. Progressive historians assist progressive politicians by spreading the notion that progressivism and righteousness are equivalent. In return, progressive politicians assist progressive historians by giving them funding, fame, and influence. Okay, hold on. This is a very important point, right? This is why the left wins and why the right loses. The left has mutual aid. They help each other out. Let's read this again. Progressive historians assist progressive politicians by spreading the notion that progressivism and righteousness are equivalent. In return, progressive politicians assist progressive historians by giving them funding, fame, and influence. Now, that's at an elite level, but we see this all the way down. And, with my first casual stream, I pointed this out. And, Moldbug, whatever money he has, I mean, he's not going to then, help prop up other dissident thinkers on the right. Not in the way that, say, a dissident thinker on the left would get propped up by wealthy benefactors. And it's just so, it's this libertarian rot, basically. It's like, well, we're just all individuals, bro. But that's why you're losing. Individuals don't win wars. Armies do. And armies are not individuals. They're a collection of men.
Yeah, don't think I have anything to add to that.
It is important to remember that this analysis is adaptive, not volitional. The historians and politicians do not meet up in some smoke-filled room where packets of 20s change hands. We are all sincere. There's no need to conspire. The key to the progressive victory, which the theory so accurately predicts, is that there is no equivalent libertarian feedback loop. Progressive historians win because progressivism itself is inherently pro-historian. Historians, after all, are enlightened and benevolent experts, and the central idea of the progressive movement was and is that the government should be run by enlightened and benevolent experts. You do the math. This is also why I dislike the idea of media bias. There's no such thing as journalism. Journalism is just recent history, and saying that journalists have a liberal bias may be true in some sense of the word. It is also deeply misleading, and worse, it understates the appalling size and scale of the problem. It is more that liberals have a journalistic bias, that the very idea of liberalism, progressive idealism, is pro-journalistic. So this statement, which seems so damning, reduces to the position that journalists are pro-journalists. This may not be a tautology, but it's close. For obvious reasons of human psychology, journalists, like other historians, are likely to favor political systems in which they themselves are more important and powerful. The same is true of poets, climatologists, economists, and, for all I know, dishwashers. Democracy does not provide any obvious way for dishwashers to influence public opinion, so no feedback loop can develop which favors self-aggrandizing schools for tableware hygiene. Otherwise, used dishes would probably have to be sent to an official sterilization facility. The same is not true of historians, poets, climatologists, or economists, and without a way of breaking the feedback loops, which certainly does not exist today, we should expect democracies to produce some extremely strange and corrupt versions of history, poetry, climatology, and economics, to name only such a few fields. Well, I mean, this sort of like you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back attitude was if it's, he thinks it's bad in a democracy. Well, what do you think it was like in the court of the Stuarts? I mean, these royal houses of Europe, that's all it was. It was just this incestuous, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. And you had to flatter the king, the emperor. There's a whole line of literature called panegyrics where you basically just, constantly fawn over. I mean, this isn't democracy per se. It's power. And of course, okay, so tie this all back together. What's Moldbug hiding? Moldbug is hiding the true reason behind the progressive movement, which was to deal with the rise of private power and corporations. As I've said before, and I agree with Noam Chomsky's position that we don't live in a democracy because corporations run everything, and corporations are anti-democratic. So he has to have this bugbear boogeyman called democracy because he's hiding the thing that's really doing all this, the corporation. And the reason why we have the similar ridiculous high living that we might find with like the Bourbons or the Romanovs is because, much like the autocracies of old Europe, we have a new autocracy. It's just one of money rather than, putative military prowess.
The other thing I find interesting about this is if you think back to his Finargle thing, the second one, where he talked about how like Finargle would rule maybe without a magic ring, and he was talking about how Finargle rules via satisfaction, and the media kind of convinces people that he loves them, and so on and so on and so forth, right? Even if we don't take the Finargle angle, let's look at the basic one. If he has a corporate state that rules by customer satisfaction or gets its consent to govern by customer satisfaction the way a CEO should or a corporation should, he wants to suck the normativity out of this and say that, well, the customers want something, the corporations will provide it to them. But what he doesn't keep in mind is marketing, right? Like you talked about. You could convince people that they want or will be satisfied by things they don't need. What does that take to do it? Marketers. Okay. So what's that going to be? Well, firm A markets for the state. State pays firm A to market for them, basically, because what you're going to have is, of all the things that people could want, if you're the state, and some things are really easy to provide and some things are really, really hard to provide, you'd much prefer people would be satisfied by easy things than hard things. And so that's what the marketer's job is. Market in such a way that the people will be satisfied by things more easily provided by the state. And then once that happens, well, what happens? You now have this incestuous relationship between the marketing firms and the state. What are the marketing firms for the current democratic establishment? The journalists. But Moldbug can't exactly be mad about that because it's exactly what he'd expect in the system that he wants.
Yeah. The Generalist Stone, A Stable Mind, June 2nd, 2007. My header describes me as a generalist. Of course, I have no idea what this is supposed to mean. It's not, well, I mean, to be honest, Logos, I don't think most of us have any idea what Moldbug means. So, it's not one of these words I'm always trying to define here at UR. If you're going to engage in the arcane and onanistic sport of coinage, you should at least have the common decency to always counterfeit and never redefine. And this is one of the few rhetorical rules I even try to respect. And all kinds of people use the word generalist to mean all kinds of weird things. For example, as a systems software man, I am a generalist. All this means is that I'm not expert in anything. I have failed at various tasks in OS research, 2D graphics, language design, and runtime systems, kernel networking, standards crap, and the absolute worst, cell phone browsers. The only thing I really learned is that the system software sucks, and I'm not at all sure why. And I'm utterly unqualified for 99% of the programming jobs in the world. So if the word generalist is interpreted literally in any context, I'm not a generalist at all. Not only do I not know Perl, JavaScript, or even Java, I have no knowledge at all of aerodynamics, Zoomergy, or of most of the things in between. So clearly, since the word is useful, and I already started using it, I need another definition. One way to be a generalist is to have, or at least asymptotically approach what I call a stable mind. A stable mind is one that need not revise itself on receiving new information defined as anything anyone else has ever known. This is as opposed to a closed mind, which may need to revise itself but doesn't. For example, suppose some awful computer error granted me an infinite security clearance, and I could read all the secret files of the United States. Worse, suppose I had infinite time to do it in. So I could even read George W. Bush's mind. Would my opinion of the entire circus that is Washington, D.C. change? I'm probably wrong, but I'd like to think not. Or suppose, like Stendhal, I could join the Grand Army of the retreat from Moscow, due perhaps to some ingenious time machine. Would this alter my opinion of the human condition? Suppose I then worked as a taxi driver in present-day Cairo, went straight from there to the Reichsbank in 1936, where I was a private secretary to Hajar Schacht, hauled nets on a shrimp boat out of Galveston in the 50s, served as a district officer in the ICS under Lord Lytton, studied Byzantine law in Constantinople sometime in the late 1200s, ran the catering of Mansa Musa's Hajj in 1324, apprenticed as a goldsmith in 18th century Salonika, learned poetry from U of R winners in 1967, and fought as a captain in the Rhodesian SAS for most of the late 70s. Obviously, I have not had any of these experiences, and barring some really impressive video game technology, am unlikely to have anything like them. However, I'd like to think that if this were not the case, adding them to my present fund of experience would not change much and need not change much of how I see the world. Again, I'm probably wrong about this, but I feel it's at least worth trying to be right. There is a feeling you sometimes get off people who, not at present, but in the way past, used to be extremely heavy stoners, serious connoisseurs of mind-altering everything. And you have since given up for mere reality, but still you feel if they were walking down the street and a triceratops suddenly materialized in front of them, they would remark, "Oh, a triceratops." And I don't know, whatever you do when you have to deal with a triceratops, fend it off with a stick or something. But the point of being a generalist is this: that you're the kind of person who doesn't like being surprised, so you try and order your surprises in advance. How many people were surprised, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed? I would say this event and its aftermath changed a lot of people's minds in quite unexpected ways, especially if said people lived in the Soviet Union. I'm going out on a long limb here, I know, but I think a lot of people in the West may one day be rather similarly surprised. Most people in the West don't think their entire system of government is fundamentally irreparably corrupt, nor did most people in the Soviet Union, or at least that's what I think. But then again, I never lived in the Soviet Union. I'm not sure at least one or two readers did, and perhaps they'll be so kind as to contradict me. So one thing is, I'm going to go back on the whole, serious again. You just can't take a guy seriously. I mean, how many, essentially like cartoon, things do we have? We have Finargle's ring, snap your fingers to kill people. What if I had a time machine? I don't know. It's like, I don't know. What if I walked out of a pulp comic? I mean, how is that relevant to any political discourse? Rather than giving us useful thought experiments that allow us to look at politics, this is just cartoonish. Like it doesn't help. Well, we've already established that Moldbug is trying to hide something, and he's trying to hide private corporate power, I think, and his own ambitions to have power. And I think this is partly on purpose, because by blowing all this smoke, you can sort of, hide what you're really trying to do. And I think that's sort of what he did, and then is doing, rather. And then the other thing is, this is great, but I feel it's at least worth trying to be right. Moldbug has not tried to be right on anything. His knowledge of history is atrocious. He can't even use his own definitions consistently. Again, it's what was that first rule? Moldbug means the opposite of what he's saying. Logos.
Yeah, my version of it is just because Moldbug says he's trying to attain some goal doesn't mean that's actually what he's in the process of doing. I don't know if he means the opposite. I'm not going to assume he's like lying every time he says something, but I mean, what he does doesn't always line up with what he says, either by his own blunder or whatever. But what's really interesting here, here's another contradiction I've just caught him in. In the previous article, he says history is more than just a body of facts. It's also a normative interpretation of the facts. So when he's talking about history, he says, I think it's worth trying to be right. Well, right according to which moral standard, according to which interpretation of history, right? To which normative notion. But wait a minute, if it's worth trying to be right, then it's worth trying to have the ethical interpretation of history. But we can't have ethics, Todd. I mean, we can't be nihilists, so we have to have some ethics. But we can't have ethics. But we should have ethics, because we should try to have a right interpretation of history. I mean, yeah. He's not hiding it. He's obviously trying to hide something, but the contradictions he's wrapping himself up to do so are at levels of cartoonish length. I can't even deal with them. They're just ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. And what I think is also interesting too is how there's so many references to sci-fi tropes. So again, he's a computer programmer. That's no surprise. Science fiction is going to be par for the course for these people. But it's just there's just a level of unseriousness about modern science fiction that when you pepper it through, a talk about history or politics or economics, it just looks goofy. So, Principles and Platitudes, June 4th, 2007. I think anyone who enjoys UR would enjoy this fine essay on diversity by John Rosenberg. And yes, Rosenberg's blog is pretty much always this sharp. Okay. I would not call Rosenberg a dissident. That is, I don't think he agrees with me that the American university system is the functional equivalent of the pre-Reformation church, or that it's at least worth debating the question of whether the only way to deal with it is the full Henry VIII treatment. Bar ruined choirs where the late Sweetbird sang. Alas, the church at least knew its ass from its elbow when it came to architecture, and even a ruined choir has a certain fuse-like charm to it. But what would remain of UC Berkeley? Rebar, junkies, and rats. Perhaps still an improvement, but let's face the choice squarely. Just because America's colleges and universities could be redeveloped as luxury condos and squash courts doesn't mean they will be. We can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In any case, I like Rosenberg's essay because it's such an elegant contrast of formalist thinking with idealist thinking. Rosenberg looks at Bullinger's words and asks, what do they mean? His answer is nothing. David Stove, as so often comes to mind. Here at UR, I've tried to explain in a very abstract and theoretical sense how the replacement of religion by idealism has allowed people who are essentially religious fanatics to achieve positions of unprecedented temporary supremacy, not only without arousing the alarm of reasonable, scientifically minded writers, but in fact enlisting their enthusiastic support. But I'm not sure I've done a very good job of illustrating this abstraction, so I'm grateful to Rosenberg for this devastating little sketch. I mean, I don't think there's much to say about this. Do you have anything to say about it, Logos?
I think we've beat the whole idealism thing to death.
Okay, we'll just moving on. Okay. The Mystery of the Gray Government, June 6, 2007. The secret of power is that power and responsibility are the same thing. Unless you have the Ring of Finargle, the only way to be powerful is to have followers, jarls, voters, henchmen, employees, unique visitors, imperial stormtroopers, etc., who respect you and ascribe some implicit trust to your decisions. To convince people to follow you is to convince them that you're a responsible leader, and by far the easiest way to convince people that you're a responsible is to actually be responsible. This may have something to do with the 5 million years of evolution. As a party gang species, humans are quite good at detecting insincerity in each other. Yeah, okay, let's just stop here. Power is the same as responsibility. No, it's not. Power is the ability to do a thing. Responsibility is someone who has shown themselves capable of doing what they say they're going to do. And so they're not the same thing. And the system we have today does not reward responsible leadership at any level in America today. I mean, all the people that are in positions of power, whether it's political or corporate or the education system, it beggars belief how I got there. I have no idea, because they're completely incompetent. And I'm just like, this is just has aged really badly.
I think the argument he's trying to make here is that people who show themselves to be irresponsible don't keep power long because they don't keep followers that trust them. And that's the part that's going to age badly, is because you have all these irresponsible people that still have power.
I mean,
I think,
look at Hunter Biden. I mean,
yeah,
right? I mean, or since this is 2007, look at Bill Clinton. I mean,
yeah.
He was extremely irresponsible, and yet, he couldn't even get impeached. So it's like, whatever.
I mean, look at
It's
Joe Biden. Joe Biden
yeah,
today. I mean, people
yeah,
more and more are making Joe. I mean, even Democrats are coming out of the woodwork saying, "Okay, yeah, he's demented, but he's our guy, so screw you." You know, all you need is to be in the right place, the right time, and have enough people that hate something else, and you can always whip that up into a frenzy and be their figurehead, even if you're the most incompetent dunderhead in history. So, yeah, this is more Austrian economist like
yeah.
thought. People are inherently rational, and therefore, if they feel their interests aren't being met, blah 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 blah. No, dummy. They're not inherently rational. Never were, never will be. That's why they're so easily controlled by marketing. That's why politics has always been such a mess and always will be. Like,
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say too is, you mentioned with Biden, you just have to have, so it's not responsibility that you need to have. You need to have people that just want you there. You can serve some end to them. So it's just self-interest. It's finding a way to appeal to other people's self-interest so that they'll support you. Because clearly the Bidens, the Clintons, the Bushes, these are not responsible people. I mean, this is 2007. I mean, this Bush at the time was being roundly lampooned in the media, and yeah, I mean he's not yeah, whatever, just ridiculous.
I got something to add to that real quick, right? He should know this because political scientists were so aghast that somebody so dumb like Bush could get office. They did a bunch of studies on this, and what they found is people voted for Bush because he's the type of guy they wanted to have a beer with. It wasn't responsibility that won the day; it was relatability.
There you go. The result is that everyone in a position of importance claims to be sincere and responsible, and almost all of them genuinely believe they are. Acting is hard. Fooling yourself is easy. At least this is my experience. What I find so interesting is that almost everyone on planet Earth disagrees with this analysis, or at least the ones who live in 2007 and speak English do. Power simply does not mean the same thing as responsibility in the modern English language. For example, what do we make of someone who describes herself as a responsible journalist whose mission is to speak truth to power? Can she succeed just by speaking to herself like a bag lady? It would certainly save on newsprint. I think what she means by power is actually what I'd call corruption. That is irresponsibility masked by the pretense of responsibility. I certainly find it hard to imagine any ethical system in which exposing corruption is anything but laudable. But this leaves us with another problem, which is Acton's famous line, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Presumably there is something to this quote because people have been quoting it nonstop for the last century. Unfortunately, if we insert the journalist's definition of power into Acton's quote, it becomes a nonsense tautology. It's certainly true that absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it does not strike me as noteworthy. So suppose we try the other definition, responsibility tends to corrupt. I'm not sure whether or not this is what Acton meant, and even if it was what Acton meant, it doesn't make him right, but it's surely an interesting proposition. If responsibility tends to corrupt, how would it do so? No, it's not an interesting proposition. That's literally absurd. Corruption is the result of irresponsibility. I mean, this is, I don't know, man. What do you say to this, Logos?
Yeah, responsibility doesn't tend to corrupt. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the line. What do you mean responsibility tends to corrupt?
Yeah. Well, let's see. And as I said, the best way to gain others' trust is and always will be genuine, sincere responsibility. By gaining trust is not the same as thing as keeping it. The latter is easier. Presumably, it tolerates a high level of self-delusion, and perhaps some genuine insincerity may creep in. And though, of course, it is impossible for us to know what Joe Schmo down the street is thinking, let alone Stalin or Mustache Man, it's also important to know that a lot of what happens to be corruption is nothing of the kind. One, in many government systems, such as Congress, a certain level of graft, e.g., campaign contributions, is necessary to get anything done. Absorbing such graft is irresponsible because the result will be total ineffectiveness. Two, not in the West, but in many foreign countries, graft flourishes as a consequence of responsibility within extended family and or tribal groups, taking precedence over the Western governmental structures that donors prefer to see. But I do believe that responsibility corrupts. However, I would not recommend arguing with that statement lightly. Most of what you know about the world probably originates in one way or another with responsible journalists, or worse, responsible historians. If these people are in any way corrupt, and there are many, many ways in which they could be corrupt, check out the work yourself in an enormous and daunting task. Trust me on this. Well, I know for you and I, Logos, we're the ones that familiarize ourselves with people's works. And it is a daunting task. And you might have come to the same conclusion as me, which frankly is a little too Philip K. Dick for my taste. Hopefully it is a little too Philip K. Dick for your taste as well. So let's suspend the act then for now and stick with the equation of responsibility and power. As Atkin examples demonstrates this equation precisely because it runs against the grain of the way we use the words in English. And a very good way of turning old chestnuts into odd and provocative thoughts. And if you're not interested in odd, provocative thoughts, you definitely clicked on the wrong URL. This is something that the more, I don't know if it's just being familiar with Moldbug now more than ever, or just these last few articles in particular. It's like Moldbug is coming up with like the most backwards, insane way of talking about things that which to try to bring light to clarify, to talk about would be useful if that's what he was actually doing. And it's just like it's really just projection. I mean, obviously I'm no fan of the progressive historians. They screwed me over in college, but I mean he's writing and he's writing himself just the way he claims that they write, and it's kind of a projection on his part.
Right.
So, okay, another example is a bumper sticker I saw the other day. It's not a rare one. You may have seen the same sticker yourself. It says, "I love my country, but I fear my government." I find this a fascinating message because I suppose you could sell the same sticker, if not with the same graphics, in San Francisco and in Lubbock County, Texas. Given that I saw it on a new Beetle in one of the most fashionable neighborhoods in SF Coal Valley, however, I don't think I'm going too far off on a limb to deconstruct it here. I don't think that the Beetle's owner was thinking of the Environmental Protection Agency when she put that sticker on her car, nor was she thinking of the State Department, the Supreme Court, the Fed, or probably even these days the CIA. In fact, the CIA, no one in Washington uses this article, much as the same road is in the 101 in LA and 101 up here. Perhaps it is a faint Russian influence. It's a fascinating example. When exactly did the agency and the New York Times become best buddies? Today, you are no more likely to find the Times or the Post criticizing the CIA than criticizing state, EPA, etc. It would be interesting to spend some quality time with the LexisNexis and see where this handover happened. Perhaps there was a secret surrender ceremony or something. I think the U.S. is best interpreted as one country with two governments. We can call these the red government and the blue government. Basically, is a very rough approximation. The red government is the military, and the blue government is everything else. Each house of Congress also has a parallel red and blue committee systems, and these are also some departments, such as the White House, that can switch colors as the result of elections, but mainly when I talk about government, I mean the permanent government. It is very difficult for political officials to exercise much direction over career civil servants. I don't know that any such polls have been taken. It would probably be considered some sort of high-tech blasphemy, but I kind of suspect that these colors corresponded to the political affiliation of the employees. This is the military probably employs more Republicans than Democrats, and the other agencies more Democrats than Republicans, just a guess. But in any case, what I find interesting about the woman who bought the bumper sticker and put it up on her Beetle is that for her, the government means the red government. That is, means the enemy of the blue government, which she is presumably a supporter. You might think she was a libertarian, and who knows, perhaps she is, but Google did find the same sticker at 100% progressive vendor. This is absolutely fascinating because for her, the blue government does not exist as such. It is simply a large number of responsible people doing responsible things. Their work, in fact, is being hindered by the government, that is the red government, a mighty power which literally dominates the planet and which is presumably quite corrupt in the Actonian sense. See, this is actually really interesting here, right? So back to what we were talking about with the progressive era and corporations. This sort of thinking that Moldbug is pointing out in this woman and her sticker. This is how Moldbug thinks, right? Let's change it, right? There's basically the sensible, hardworking, responsible people in business that make America and the world work, and there's these big bad boogeyman, the blue progressives, who try to, steal my money through taxes and, create this bloated Caesarian state, which Moldbug wants anyhow, so I don't really get that. But it's funny, right? Because he's making fun of her, but he's literally doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's perennial to all politics, so I don't know what he's getting at.
Yeah. In fact, I'm sure our Beetle owner could list quite a few ways in which the red government is irresponsible and is abusing its power, nor would it strike her as a contradiction that while I am sure she is a passionate believer in democracy, she is effectively supporting an unelected government over an elected one. She might well believe that the current occupation of the White House was not legally elected, and if she didn't, she would consider the election an outrage, the product of trickery, bribery, and lies. To a Catholic, the election of a false pope does not discredit the papacy, it renders reform imperative. Now imagine the same sticker on the back of a F-150 in Lubbock, Texas. Obviously, it means something entirely different, but our truck driving Texan is actually going through a set of thought processes that are very similar to him. The military is not. The government, it is America. To him, the blue government is the government and is screwing up everything. And he too can present a very compelling list of irresponsibilities. Obviously, since I live in San Francisco, my instinct is to side with the Lubbockite, because probably if I lived in Lubbock, it would be go the other way. All this means is that I'm a misanthrope. It doesn't provide you with any information about the correctness of either side. But the lesson I take from this situation is that it's very much in the interest of any powerful person to have the same relationship to his Jarls that the EPA has to the Beetle driver, or that the DoD has to the Ford driver. Once people have started to see you as powerful rather than responsible, a crack has appeared in your armor. You have enemies, and who wants enemies? And suppose there is a third government, which both sides see as responsible, not powerful. Could we call it the gray government? I think this would be a very appropriate name. Perhaps we'll investigate this a little further. I think that's going to be a segue into the cathedral at some point, but I don't know. This one was kind of an extended, metaphor about this woman's bumper sticker. It was kind of boring.
Yeah, I don't think this one's going into the cathedral. I think this one's going into parallelism. The idea that you make a third position gray government that just exists to help meet people's everyday needs. They'll see you as responsible, not powerful. They'll flock to you and voluntarily try to disassociate from the red and blue government. That basically seems to be what he's trying to build there. And there's some merit to that, as you and I have talked about. This idea that Christianity and other sorts of true conservative movements can actually spread by doing what OG Christianity did and just trying to meet people where they are, get their needs met, and build grassroots political organizations. I think that's how you build like true ties that won't be severed, because all the political movements just want giant stadium rallies around figureheads without any true meaningful connections. And so it's very, very easy for people to cut the heads off snakes, so to speak, or make people lose trust in their idols and so on. And so it's really hard to get any actual grassroots support against the establishment when everything is just, figureheads controlled by establishments. So there's something there to what he's saying, but I think his discussions of power and responsibility are clouding it.
Yeah, that was a mess. Liquid, June 7th, 2007. Define one as anything not made of things so smooth and small that pass between themselves, nor so sticky that they grab and won't let go. This is why a glass made of glass is useful, both for holding a drink and for drinking it. Liquids that for their own reason don't mix, like oil and water or orange juice and scotch. The first can be flicked into the fireplace. As the second walks backward down your throat and rappel with wire rope and thumbtack cleats, a hazardous move when executed in reverse. This is the essential element of the phase. The recursive triple entendre with duck dive and backhand chainsaw pass. Liquid's not solid, you might say, but it can still say anything. And it isn't gas because it might say something. Whatever. Moldbug's poetry, I guess. Well, you have to go soon, right, Logos? This one probably will take a while.
Scroll down a bit again. How long was it? We can do this one.
Okay. All right. Last article, guys. Why there's no such thing as liberal media bias. June 7th, 2007. I'm not a conservative. I'm a formalist. But I read a lot of conservative blogs. You'll see many of them linked on the sidebar. And there are others such as Little Green Footballs and Powerline, which are for various reasons don't meet the high linking standards of UR, but which I swing by occasionally just to get a feel for what's up. The reason I read conservative but not progressive blogs is pretty straightforward. I was raised in the Brahmin caste, studied at Brahmin universities, and I lived in a Brahmin city. Since progressive idealism is, of course, the belief system of the Brahmins, I'm almost as likely to encounter surprising new progressive idealists' ideas as Ted Kennedy is likely to learn something new about Catholicism. Whereas the world of American conservatism is a foreign country to me, I'll never be entirely fluent in its language, and that's just fine. I'm not a Christian, and I have no particular problem with abortion, rampant homosexuality, ear grommets, rock music. Not that I don't respect and understand the conservative loathing of these phenomena or even understand the connection between them and cultural decay, which I do deplore. It's just that I think the kinds of issues that most annoy conservatives as symptoms rather than causes, and I neither have a visceral emotional reaction to them nor think attacking them will do much to solve what I see as underlying disease. Well, okay. I mean, so far so good, right? A lot of, and I've said this before too, a lot of modern conservatism is dealing with symptoms rather than causes, but I don't think we should have a whole lot of trust that Moldbug will give us a true understanding of the underlying causes. Right. So let's see what they are. It's hard for me to escape the general conclusion that conservatism is a losing cause. In fact, I think it plays more or less the same role that the generals did for the Globetrotters. The name of the game is American public opinion, and American public opinion on any issue you can name in 2007 is really, really far to the left of where it was in 1957. To the progressives, of course, there is no more than progress. In fact, it's scandalous that change has been so slow and halting. This is due to the cowardice of the corrupt corporate media, not to mention the shills at PBS. To conservatives, I'm really not sure how conservatives conceptualize this fact. If I was, I might be a conservative. And this is why the conservatives are like the generals. They never seem to notice that they're always losing. No one seems to find this odd at all. I've never heard any conservative suggest that the American political system is fundamentally and incurably anti-conservative. Presumably, considering the trend of the last 50 years, heck, the last 200 years, you'd think this thesis might occur to someone, but no. Of course, conservatives believe in America, so why would it? The idea that the mainstream media suffers from liberal bias is very typical of the conservative pathology. This idea is a pure loser. I think if we examine it for a moment, we'll get a very nice understanding of why conservatives can't lay a finger on Meadowlark Lemon. Of course, anyone with an IQ over 80 knows that mainstream media is, in fact, the U.S. official press. No, the New York Times and the CNN are not formal government agencies like the BBC or TASS. Technically, journalists are corporate serfs like the rest of us. But in fact, as Walter Lippmann pointed out in 1922, who controls public opinion has the nation by its balls, and woe unto any mere CEO who dares to screw with them. Journals run the world. They are, in other words, responsible. And if the American journalism were in fact recognized into a Department of Information, as Lippmann suggests, their jobs would hardly change. From the conservative perspective, this is hardly the end of the world. The problem is that almost everyone who works for the Department of Information is for some reason a liberal, so the solution is just to have conservative voices in the media, or even a new the new conservative media, Fox News, the Washington Times, the New York Sun. After all, just as many Americans are conservatives as liberals, so they should have a right to get the story from people they agree with. This is exactly why conservatives keep losing. They see their problems as solvable. True, they never seem to get solved, but it can't hurt to keep trying, can it? Well, actually it can, because it maintains the illusion that the game is competitive. To see why it's not, it's interesting to look at a progressive use of the same problem. For example, you can read Elric Atlerman or Alexander Cockburn or Ben Bagdikian from the perspective of all three of these gentlemen, and they are not at all exceptional. The media is actually hopelessly conservative. He forgot Noam Chomsky. This is the same kind of people, and of course, Noam Chomsky did manufacturing consent. And when you read them, you understand why. It's conservative because it's more conservative than they are. And since they are right, this can only be explained by insidious media monopolies, which have reduced the supposedly independent, courageous, crusading journalist to a mere corporate shill. This viewpoint is actually quite reasonable. First of all, everyone thinks of him or herself as right. To think otherwise would be inconsistent. So if you believe, for example, that George W. Bush let 9/11 happen so that he could crown himself Duce 2.0 and some vice president of news tells you that, no, you cannot pursue his story, you have every reason to think that he or she is concerned about how the advertisers would react, as he or she probably is. The nut of the problem is that little word, mainstream. As Lippmann pointed out, in a democracy, who controls the mainstream controls the state. The idea that any change in public opinion must be due to some mysterious cosmic rectitude, vox populi, vox dei, is the reason I consider democracy a form of idealism, and specifically a sect of Christianity. In democracy with a free press, the press is the government. Public opinion on any subject will naturally shift toward the opinions of those who explain that to the public. So that's subject to the public. But you see, I mean, the press is always in control, though. I mean, look at the totalitarian regimes of Europe in the 30s and 40s. They had propaganda all the time. No let up in the propaganda. I mean, that's just modern politics. It's not unique to democracies.
But Todd, they were democracies, remember?
Oh, that's right. They were, but they're also formalists, though. So, like, I don't know. Okay, and it's not just that. In the English language, as we use it now, words like progressive and conservative are actually relative designations. Progressive means left of the mainstream, and conservative means right of the mainstream. When the mainstream shifts, these words have to shift as well, and the result is that many of the radical left-wing ideas of 1907 will be radical right-wing ideas in 2007. No, that's ridiculous. In 1907, you have like the Marxists and anarchists. That was radical left-wing ideas. That's not radical right-wing today. Again, his use of history is just appalling. It's just like, wow.
He's really trying for the Dabney quote, but he's failing.
Yeah, well, Dabney said it much more concisely, better. So when we say the mainstream media has a liberal bias, that's what we're actually saying is that it's to the left of itself. This claim is obviously false, and Alterman and company are perfectly safe ground in ridiculing it. And this is why conservatives fail. They fail because the real problem is much too large to solve with any of the tools at their disposal. So instead, they've invented a fake problem which is unsolvable because it doesn't exist. This gives conservatives something to do, and it gives people who don't like the system something to vote for. Okay, now this paragraph here, I actually agree with 100%. And I think what we see in the modern West is that's what everybody's doing. It's not just conservatives, right? Because, we talk about the Clintons, back in the day in the 90s, talk about the vast right-wing conspiracy. They have their own, legion of boogeymen that they are fighting against, but it's not real. And a lot of the problems in modern politics is people have basically these extended LARP sessions where much of what they do isn't in any way related to something real. It's just a political theater.
Yep.
But the whole conservative movement serves the same purpose as the toy opposing parties of East Germany or, again, the Washington Generals. Of course, it works better than either of these entities because it actually does its job. It convinces Americans that their government is the product of a competitive adversarial process. The real problem is that the U.S. public opinion is managed by cradle-to-grave information system, the apex of what I call the polygon. Consisting of the media, schools, and universities, it is very difficult even to tell what lies this system has inculcated in its purported customers. it is in fact telling if it is in fact telling any lies at all, we all grew up believing in them. And so probably did our great great grandparents. Progressivism is to the polygon as monarchism is to the king, and progressive education is not a new idea. Furthermore, there is good reason to believe that a stable democracy cannot exist without such an information system, because democracies in which different groups of voters have different versions of reality tend to be rather violent. In fact, since the internet is starting to route around the polygon, both for the left and the right, such pleasures may await us as well. As Trotsky put it, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Conservatism, at least as presently constituted, is about as capable of solving this problem as Jar Jar Binks is of defeating Emperor Palpatine, and this is why I'm not a conservative. Of course, UR is about as capable of solving it as C-3PO is of defeating Emperor Palpatine. I don't even have a pair of huge meat dreadlocks with which to beat him about the head and the shoulders, but at least I have a knack for protocols, a wiry midriff, and no illusions. So,
I mean, he forgot that the truth of everything is that Jar Jar Binks was the ultimate Sith Lord. If
yeah, he
anybody
forgot
could beat
that.
Palpatine, it was Jar Jar Binks. So looks
Yeah,
like conservatives win anyway.
Well, okay, I'm going to have to just say this again because I get so tired of this. We don't live in a democracy. He keeps on saying democracy, democracy, democracy. Well, he mentioned Lippmann. We mentioned him twice today in these articles. Lippmann admits this isn't a real democracy. It's a managed democracy because we have all these people living in urban environments. We have, top-down structures of control with both the government, with corporations, and with the broader technical infrastructure that what Moldbug was rolling out in 2007. All of which is anti-democratic and democracy. So yeah, democracy is so in the sense of for the conservatives, he mentioned that the liberal media bias was this shadow boxing that they do. That's what it is for the left. There is no real democracy. Some of the more radical thinkers like Chomsky will say so, but it's just this isn't. But again, why does he have to keep saying democracy? Why does he have to keep doing this? Because the institution, the two institutions that are making America so dysfunctional, the corporations themselves, which he's working for, and tech companies, which are rolling out, which again he's working for. He's a computer programmer, rolling out all of these top-down control grids. That's the problem. But then he'd have to re-examine his whole life and get a different profession, and he's not going to do that. So he's going to come up with, his equivalent of the liberal media bias, which is democracy.
Yeah, you want to talk about this whole responsibility paradigm. Forget CNN, forget all that stuff. We're responsible journalists. How about Google with their search algorithms? How about Twitter, Facebook? All these companies that are just responsible for managing social interactions on the internet. We don't have any true power, guys. We're not like that. We don't work with the CIA or anything, right? We just have all this responsibility for making sure people behave and don't spread in misinformation and all the rest of it, which we'd later come to see. So if anything, these articles we've been reading have been kind of like a peek behind the curtain, right? This responsibility versus power narrative, which he's directing at the media, CNN, all those people, is really going to be the narrative that would be spun by tech companies in the 2010s that they'd use to hide their power level, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's really good insight there. Any other thoughts on this last article here?
I mean, I agree with him that the conservatives can't solve this problem. I disagree with him about why the conservatives can't solve this problem. This whole the media has a liberal bias thing, right? This goes back to that question that I asked of those two popular panelists a while back, right, about liberalism. Why is it, if you take classical liberalism and you just let it go into one of two logically consistent paths, you either get atomism and some kind of quasi-Austrian view where you have all these people making contracts to corporations and people following the rational interest to kind of carve up the world atomistically. What happens? Well, you have a plurality of media outlets, a plurality of views. Truth doesn't really matter because what matters is what sells. Like, because people can say, like, well, people will be rational, want to know what's true, but I mean, we just look at the data and we know that's false. Um, and so if you let like the libertarian version of classical liberalism run rampant, then you have all these media outlets, and there's no truth making because there's no central truth making apparatus with responsibility. That's another interesting thing too, is his noting of responsibility and how it can be abused. I don't think what he's talked about enough is the fact that the responsibility itself can dissolve as people lose trust in the institutions having responsibility. So CNN has this responsibility. They're letting a bunch of people down. The right say they have a liberal bias. What they're saying is we don't trust CNN with the responsibility to do this. So they have Fox News or something else. Well, the left doesn't trust Fox News. And let's suppose radical left people no longer trust CNN, like he talked about with his academic saying CNN was not left enough for them. MSNBC rules up, more left-wing outlets on the internet rules up. And eventually you get to the point where no one institution has the responsibility for doing this because they've all kind of abdicated the responsibility to do this to chase their market shares. And that's what happens if you take like the liberal version or the libertarian version of classical liberalism. But if you take the more conservative view of classical liberalism, where you still have duties and responsibilities, you do still have central apparatus with responsibilities to manage stuff, but you have to be heavy-handed in managing those people and make sure they're doing their responsibilities fairly. So, for example, if CNN's going to call itself the press, maybe you have an independent organization, anonymous. You don't know who they are. That aren't picked by the government or anything else. Credentialed academics and people close to stories anonymously picked to see if media is getting them right. And if the media gets them wrong, they get a black mark and they're no longer press if they get too many strikes or something, right? Um, People with press can do certain things that people that aren't press can't, and so on, because they have this independent check and balance. Well, the more libertarian classical liberalists would say that's too authoritarian, that's too heavy-handed. But okay, but their view results in responsibility of these institutions dissolving completely until everybody just like kind of trusts their guys to tell them what's what, and there's no institutions anyway. If you want to keep the trust, you have to have a managing party to make sure everybody's playing fair, which means a higher system of authority managing things. It's there has to be a check and a balance. Um, and so that's the catch-22 that plagues Republicans. They're afraid of any authoritarian solution that will solve the problems in a way with lasting consequences. They knee-jerk toward the libertarian response because Republicans have been co-opted by libertarians. But because they've been co-opted by libertarians, all the institutions they think should be responsible but aren't due to liberal bias, they have a worldview that on rails will result in the dissolution of all responsibility entirely, because they think private corporations should roughly be able to do what they want. People can consent to do what they want with private corporations. And so that's the real problem. But Moldbug isn't going to talk about that. Republicans don't seem to want to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about that, and that's the real killer.
Well, nobody wants to talk about it. Well, and again, this is just sort of the joke, right? I think I showed this to you a few days ago on Keith Woods on his Telegram. He captioned, I can't think of his name right now. Wow, I can't think of his name now. The libertarian guy that had UPB, universally preferable behavior. Oh, hold on a second. This is relevant. Let's see. Here we go. Yeah, Stefan Molyneux. I don't know why I couldn't think of his name. He said corporations can do whatever the heck they want, and then they kick him off YouTube. It's like, it's hilarious. It's like, what these people are just, I don't know what to say. And again, the reason, this is why I think, and it's another way of saying what you said, Logos. The reason why the conservatives lose is because their primary identity is their class interest as the petite bourgeoisie. And the petite bourgeoisie always loses. Always. The actual bourgeoisie squeezes them out if it's a corporate takeover, or there's a revolution. Either way, you lose. The petite bourgeoisie are just like the most useless people out there. They never do anything to actually win. They constantly, hold people back. And there's a tug of war, going on between revolutionaries and the bourgeoisie, and they're just in the middle, camping out, just not doing anything. And on top of all that, it's not profitable, right? Right, solving the problem isn't profitable, and all they care about is making money. So simple as, until the solution is profitable, they're not going to do it.
Right. Exactly. Like I said, it's more profitable for all the responsibility to be drained out of institutions and atomized to various corporations that people will go to who they trust. Like even consider like the current events thing, like COVID or something else, right? Uh, I mean, the conservative solution to the problem that I've seen. Well, you've got a lot of different conservative solutions. That's an interesting kettle of fish in of itself, right? Because Trump is pro warp speed, pro vaccine. Many conservatives aren't. Like whatever. Um, but overall, the conservative response just seems to be to further atomize the medical profession. Let people see their doctors they trust. Everybody works everything out with their doctors. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have like a whole spectrum of doctors prescribing a whole spectrum of things to different people. And it's just one more instance where the solution is okay, well, the left has co opted the institution. The best way to win is to drain all the responsibility from the institution and redirect that responsibility to a bunch of atomized participants within the institution, be they individual doctors, corporations, or so have you. And so no one party is responsible for screwing anything up if something gets screwed up in the future, but everybody can be happy because they're seeing their preferred thing. Like people can more comfortably put all their individual wishes or responsibility on the individuals they're more comfortable interacting with. But because everything's become so atomized that nobody's really accountable for anything, there are no longer any safeguards if anything goes wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have one super chat. 32 shekels by Ori Samsonov. Thank you. Have a great week. That's roughly 10 US dollars. So that's pretty nice. Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I have to say is, again, what does the alt-right always say? The people that you can't talk about are the people that are really running things. So from, this sort of perspective, it's the computer programmers, the engineers, the CEOs, right? On the right, you're not allowed to talk about those people because those are the people that are running everything. And Moldbug is expressing his class interest this way, but he's also in the petite bourgeoisie class, and that's also partly why I think Moldbug is so scatterbrained. Is because it's part of the class identity of these people to be like that.
Yep.
All right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis of the Praisify podcast signing off.